dear guests, thank you very, very much for coming here. It is hard to express how great a pleasure it is for us to welcome Sean Scully to Budapest. In this extraordinary situation, we have decided to open his exhibition with a more intimate event instead of the grand opening we usually have. It is a huge privilege for us that Sean has accepted our invitation to give a talk at the Hungarian National Gallery. When I started to work on Sean's retrospective show, two publications made the most enormous impact on my thinking about Scully's art. David Carrier's groundbreaking monograph and a book entitled Inner, edited by Kelly Grovier, which contains Sean Scully's collected writings, interviews, and lectures. Sean is among the few artists who can speak and write eloquently about their own art. His poetic short texts, poem-like aphorisms, and long lectures shed light on many aspects of his artistic practice and bring us close to his very personal and at the same time universal visual language. Sean Scully is an eternal passenger, born in Ireland, raised in England, becoming world famous in the US, and returning now and then to Europe, as his art is based on the great European traditions of painting. He has exhibited his works around the globe and has given lectures in many countries and continents. His work integrates multicultural experiences from the visuality of Moroccan textiles to the ancient ruins of Mexico and the repetitive rhythms of urban cityscapes in Manhattan. He is a passenger, and his oeuvre can be interpreted as a sensual and intellectual journey, a constellation of varied forms and formats that change and move like passengers in an endless space. In one of his interviews, Scully said, quote, "It has a relationship with Lego, the way Lego is put together. This is the way that we think now. I'm making painting the same way that you move blocks of text around on a computer and put them in different places and move images around as if the parts are interchangeable." End quote. Although these sentences are about his recent works, like An Inside Out or What Makes Us Do, both of them are on the Budapest show, they are also true for Scully's overall artistic practice. He moves, pairs together, and inserts panels or fields of color, and thus creates structures of emotion and human relationships. While preparing and installing the show, I thought a lot about Sean's words. I moved sections and artworks from one place to another and did my best to achieve a dynamic balance to find a Scully-esque structure. We are very thankful to Sean Scully and his studio for the generous help he gave us during the planning and preparing of his retrospective show in Budapest. It was an enormous privilege for me to enter his studio and experience the great dimensions of his art and his personality, and to stay in touch with him and exchange thoughts and ideas from day to day. It is an exceptional challenge to introduce someone who doesn't need any introduction, whose name, as the great American philosopher Arthur C. Danto declared, belongs on the shortest of short lists of the major painters of our time. Instead of a proper introduction, let me share a story with you. The legendary Hungarian writer Antal Szerb edited a book entitled 100 Poems. The anthology contains selected masterpieces from the history of poetry. Many of them are surely among Scully's favorites. He's a great reader. At the end of the book, Szerb provided short biographies of all poets. When he arrived at the letter G to the name of Goethe, instead of a biography, he wrote only one sentence. He was Goethe. Instead of a regular introduction, I'd like to paraphrase Antal Szerb. Our speaker today is Sean Scully, who is Sean Scully. thank you very much again, Sean, for coming here in these extraordinary times. And thank you very much for bringing your works here and having you here. It is a great privilege for all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello. Very nice to be here with my family, my lovely mother-in-law who comes from the Balaton, Galéria. It's very special for us because this is one of our two home origin countries, the other being Ireland. So, this is a painting that I didn't paint, and I wanted to use this painting to illustrate the importance of art. Somebody asked me about how art is important and how this manifests itself, how it functions. I went to a very, very rough school. It was a terrible school, actually, and it was next to a gas factory. So the old coal, the dust in the air from the old coal was floating around in the playground all the time. And our skin and clothes were covered in this black carbon every day. It was the roughest school in South London. And this school was really a factory for the production of manual workers. And in the main hall of the school was a poster in a frame of this painting by Picasso. And this painting shone as a lighthouse in my young life. Every day I would see this in the assembly hall, and every day I studied it. And I was only 8 years old. And I noticed that the child was separated from the ground, from earthly trouble, by being outlined in black, which is, of course, something that Picasso did, which in fact influenced pop artists later. And there was a beach ball that represented the only bright color in the painting, a child's toy. And the child, of course, is holding a dove, which is the bird of peace, a symbol of peace and tranquility and love. So this painting provided for me a second reality that modified the reality that I was growing up in, which was indeed harsh. And it guided me onto the second part of my life. So I saw this painting basically every day or every school day for 3 years, which is about 1,000 times, using rough math. Later on, I had my own child, and I painted this. And as you can see, I didn't sign it Picasso. I used my own name, and I changed the beach ball into a Sean Scully painting. And in every other respect, it's quite similar, except that I noticed that my painting is more gentle than the Picasso. The Picasso seems darker, more, in a way, more ominous. And mine, which is a little bleached out in this photograph, is somehow sweeter. So I was painting what I felt. I was painting not a copy of the Picasso, but the effect of the Picasso on me. And this is the effect. It's a gentle painting where a child has the care, intelligence, concern, and power to hold peace in its hands. And I painted this, of course, for my son. And it's the same size exactly. When I was at university, I made a trip to Morocco. Before I made this trip, I was making figurative paintings in the abstract expressionist, or the expressionist style, and in the Fauve style. When I went to Morocco, I was so bedazzled by all the structures and how all the structures seemed to imply or conjure up a rhythmical, spiritual sense that, of course, I didn't understand in a technical manner. You know, I wasn't able to decode all the writings, which say actually relentlessly, Allah is great. But I was intoxicated by the color and the patterns and the references to the sky and the geometry, the stripes that I saw everywhere on the floor, people's robes, on the walls, in carpets, tiles, entrances. And this had a tremendous effect on me. When I came back to the north of England, I began painting these super grids, which were in a sense a fusion of the bridges over the River Tyne, which was an old shipbuilding town in Newcastle, and the patterns that I saw in Morocco, where I spent the whole summer. And eventually I was actually sleeping on the ground in a jalaba, wearing it nearly all the time. So the effect on me was profound and immersive. This was the beginning of my career as an abstract painter. Then I went to Harvard. I started to mess around with the all-overness of this, and the idea of the insert, the figure or the stranger, began to reassert itself in my work. The substitute for the figure being the insert, so that the evenness of the painting, the homogeneity of the painting was broken by this visitation, which of course relates to the Annunciation paintings of Caravaggio and others. So you've got one thing imposing itself and another thing causing this strange futuristic landscape that looks as if it's an aerial view of a future space city. After my year at Harvard, I moved to New York. And New York was an extremely brutal environment, very competitive and difficult, especially for a European at that time. It's important to note that in those days, in the 70s, there was a catchphrase used in Europe. If you wanted to discredit or get rid of somebody who was from Europe, and the catchphrase was, quite simply put, it's too European, which meant the person who was making the work was not direct enough, not simple enough, not condensed enough, not flat enough. that the person was carrying too much cargo in their work or trying to represent too many things simultaneously. And American art became very famous for being direct. And minimalism, which I became fascinated by, was a purification, in a sense, of the trashy commercialism and involvement in consumerism that was portrayed by pop art, which of course in turn was a reaction to the emotional complexities and maudlin self-pity of abstract expressionism. So it was a reformation followed by a reformation. And what I made, in a certain sense, was a counter-reformation, because I put stuff back in after this period. But in this period, you can see the rigor of my work. And I made these paintings for 5 years. And my work could not be accused of being too European. I painted minimalism with a vengeance, with a commitment that was utter. So in other words, I did what the other European artists did not do. And nearly all of them had to leave because their work and they themselves were not relentless and ruthless and rigorous enough. And being a practiced immigrant, coming from Ireland to England, and then going from England to America, it occurred to me that whatever it is that one wants in life, one has to pay for. And my father always said, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, I wasn't in Rome, but I was in New York. So I did as the New Yorkers, and I did it more than they did it. I did it to the point where they themselves could hardly stand the rigor of my work. And I made these black and gray paintings that were super severe, as I said, for 5 years. But what I was doing during that 5 years was gathering power and establishing myself as a person of critical importance. During that 5 years, I in fact appeared on the cover of Art Forum, which in those days meant something, and was very unusual for a guy from outside to achieve. Now, when I made my move, in other words, to explode the possibilities of abstraction, to reconnect it, to put it back in touch with all the beautiful things that we have seen achieved by the history of painting and all the connections that I wanted to make with people, feelings, and thoughts, of course, and combining an art of intellect and emotion, I had been slowly filling up my engine for these 5 years. And of course, I didn't realize exactly what I was going to do. This is in hindsight. I'm speaking now in hindsight. But I did know that I had to do something to change the situation because it was becoming too remote. And you would see exhibitions of minimalism that were attended by 2 people. You'd see an aircraft hangar with 2 little paintings in it, or or a piece of plywood in the corner that was painted red. And that was an exhibition. Well, I knew this couldn't go on because art had stopped saying anything. And it became more and more and more princely, aristocratic. It occurred to me that the people who were supporting this kind of extreme minimalism were in fact rather aristocratic, like Panza and Menil. These were very, very wealthy, high-born people, and they were supporting an art of great refinement. But the problem is, of course, you can't keep refining something, because the more you refine it, the more raw material you take out of it, rather like the difference between raw sugar and refined sugar, which is actually not any good for you. So I was thinking about it like this, and then I began to make these paintings that were broken up and put back together again, thinking a lot about Cubism. Hence the use of the color pink, which was used conspicuously by Picasso. And I was breaking the picture edge, making protrusions down on the bottom right corner for you. There is a protrusion, a patch stuck on top of another panel. And nothing seemed to fit. Everything was breaking up and being put back together. So there was a fight between unity and disunity, which is almost like saying that there was a fight in me between the possibility to continue making abstract paintings or not, whether this was possible or not. And of course, I was fighting for its future. As you can see, there's also this play between distance. So distance is indicated by the narrow bands in the far distance and by the wider bands in the near distance, but everything was forced to be flattened out. So there was a real fight going on. Then it occurred to me, or occurred to a friend of mine, that it almost looked like an altarpiece. So since I was so adoring of painting and of the history of painting, I named it Adoration. Quite quickly towards some real difficult paintings for people. I mean, you can't imagine how people were shocked by these pictures of disunity, with the insistence of unity being manifested by the will of the paint and the will of the artist, the physical commitment to join this together with paint. And at the same time recognizing the difficulty of it, but it began to be figurative, also metaphorical, figurative, making references to nature. And all this followed very quickly a period of art where the most agreed upon artwork apparently was a grey square titled Untitled. And this is what I was reacting to and what I was trying to replace, which I believe I have. The paintings are very raucous, very unruly. They don't add up in a certain way, and they are far from perfection, but they have energy and a reconnection with things that matter to people, like nature, like trees, like rivers, like figures, and they also flirt with the idea of the sculptural. And this painting I gave the title, The Bather. And it's, in a sense, an homage to the wonderful painting that's in the Chicago Art Institute of the same name by Matisse, which is a painting of green and blue and figures in the forest. This painting is called Rock Me. You know, I've had a very long and passionate relationship with music. I was in a rock band, I had blues club, and so I titled this painting after I believe a B.B. King song called Rock Me. And I thought of it as a real rock and roll painting that's made out of pugnacious parts that are kind of consigned to share eternity together, but don't really want to. So these paintings were as much about disunity as unity. And you know, you have to see them in their time, in the mid-80s or the early 80s, when everybody had been conditioned towards looking at seriality and perfection in the promotion of a kind of purity, a severity, and an otherworldly quality manifested in the work of, for example, Ryman or Judd or Andre. And in these paintings of mine, of course, I'm dialoguing with figurative painters, but I'm not a figurative painter. You know, there are other painters knocking around at the time, the greatest of which, in the figurative tradition, might be Baselitz, and the extravagant or insistent, sensual, sexual paint surface that I was making was very aggressive, especially in relation to the refinement of the previous epoch. So I'm also introducing colors like the color of the sea, the color of the sky, nature, overpainting. You can see paint color coming through from the back between the brown, which refers again to nature. So I'm back outside the studio. It's as if you were looking at art during the time of post-impressionism, which was all in the studio and conceptual, and impressionism had been invented after post-impressionism, and there I was bringing painting out again into the street, looking at the way the city was slapped together, looking at the way things don't really fit anymore, looking at the way that they work okay anyway, and the way that people are obliged in the city to live cheek by jowl, side by side, on top of each other, pushing against each other, not really getting along, but making a strange, new, interesting reality. That's what I was doing with these paintings. And of course, at the time when I was painting them, I got a hell of a lot of criticism from my contemporaries who later began to make similar relationships. Well, of course, I was supported, and nothing succeeds like success. I was supported in Germany, and this made a big difference, I have to say. So this painting is quite a barren painting. As the decade went on, the works flattened out, and I began to be much more interested in the idea of the insert or the window. And I made this painting, which is based on very subtle differences between four colors: cream, pink, blue, black, brown, black. And it has great nuance in it in terms of color, but it's very brutal in the way it's painted and in the way that the insert is simply pushed into the middle of the painting like a real window. Well, it is a real window. This has a lot to do with the title of the show, of course, because the show is called Passenger, and I was very interested in the idea or the tradition of putting a painting inside a painting, or a window inside a painting, a figure inside a painting. They conjure up all aspects of visitation, annunciation, window paintings, which of course go back to the Renaissance. I noticed a beautiful painting in the other room as we walked in. There's a picture of a cellar, Keller, of a father and a daughter, I think, if I'm right. And in the corner of the painting in the next room is a window. So you have a claustrophobic, airless situation that is opened up by a view. So what I was trying to do was to make painting, once again, enriched and dialectical, not just a single view, which is, of course, very strongly against an American view of art, which is this red square is red and it's a square. And it's irrefutably so. It's a tautology. And what I was trying to do is to make art, once again, able to contain narrative, metaphor, and dimension, and to be complex. So you're looking at two things at the same time, or two paintings at the same time. This is a period I went through in the 90s. These are called floating paintings, and I thought that they were kind of interesting because when you go on one side of the painting, you can't remember what was really on the other side of the painting. And when you walk around the painting and you look at the other side of the painting, indeed, you can't remember what was on the other side of the painting. So it plays around with the idea of memory, but it still insists on being a painting. Metaphorically, I thought that painting was under great duress in the 90s, and in a sense had lost its position. And its position really traditionally is always on the wall, flat, so I turned it out to represent a loss of security. And indeed, inside the box, there is something that you can't see, that you feel, that I took up later on in sculptures that I made, that something that contains a space. And ever since I was a child, I've always been fascinated in boxes, treasure boxes, boxes that contain secrets or precious things that you want to look after, carry with you. I guess it's because we moved around so much and because we were travelers that boxes and cases have always had a great significance for me, because most of my stuff was in boxes or in bags or in cases, always ready to move. So these paintings these floating paintings allude to an insecurity. This is a painting that I made over decades. And I don't know why I did that, but I got the title from a rock concert. A singer that I like very much, who's a bit of a grumpy guy, but still, they made good music. David Byrne gave us a very nice concert wearing a misfitting felt suit. And at the end of the concert, he said, "Any questions?" Which I absolutely loved, because rock and roll, unlike painting, is not really very philosophical. And the kind of questions you might ask about rock and roll wouldn't make much sense. And I loved the absurdity of this. I wanted to make a painting with the same title. And I was thinking that on one side of the painting was a perfect stripe standing in for the figure that, of course, relates to Olga Rozanova's beautiful painting from 1916, I believe, which is a green stripe right down the middle of the painting. And I was thinking about the perfection of that, the singularity of that, against another part of the painting that I imagined had fallen off the back of a truck and got broken up and then had to be put back together again. And then give it the title, Any Questions? Any questions regarding something that just continually asks questions. And what I found when I was making this painting is that it wouldn't leave me alone, and it kept asking me if I had any questions. So I kept repainting it. But I only ever repainted the right side of the painting. The left side of the painting was so perfect, and I could never quite get anything to equal it. And again, the influence of Cubism is very strong in this painting, because Cubism being about the crisis of the object and the broken thing, the lack of respect that we have for unity, was all broken, and it didn't quite fit together, and it didn't quite make a rectangle anymore. So anyway, in the end, I've ended up with this, and after the experience that I'm going to recount to you, I realized that either I break the painting or the painting breaks me. And this painting almost did break me. I hired a guy to move it around, and being an Irish guy, he refused to take the heavy end, even though I was paying him. And he was about 30 years younger than me. So I had to take the heavy end. And I realized when we were carrying it that this painting took all of me to move the damn thing after it was finished. I woke up a couple of weeks later with a hernia. So this painting caused me to have an operation, And I realized that it was time to stop painting the painting, because we had asked each other questions over, I think, 30 years. And this is its final stage. Of course, I could repaint it again. Of course, I could have more fun with it, but I just simply don't want to. It is arrived. This painting is, in fact, two paintings. It was a grey painting that I retrieved as a colour painting, which is very unusual for me, because usually if I work a painting for a very long time, melancholia, which is very big in my life, creeps in and the painting becomes more reduced in colour. For me to make a bright, colourful painting, I need to get up and I need to keep that feeling going, and it's not really subject to correction. I have to paint with a degree of euphoria. But this painting was a grey painting, and then I started to think about Mexico, which is a country that I visited a great deal, and it's had an effect on me in the way that Morocco did, because of its colourful roughness, the way that things are slapped together, which fits perfectly with what I do. It's shambolic urbanity is something that I find very, very human, very inspiring in its imperfection. So I kept painting this painting, and then I was thinking of Zacatecas, which is a great town in northern middle of Mexico. And I had a wonderful lunch there one day. I drove into this colonial town. I thought it was very beautiful. And I've since found out it's where all the drug lords live. So I was quite lucky, really, to get in and out without any trouble. Anyway, this painting with its exotic color and its patched together drawing is called Wall of Light, Zacatecas. And I've made quite a few paintings that are dedicated to Mexico because of the light in Mexico and because of the primitive geometry that I see in some of the architecture. Not only the architecture of antiquity, but the way that the architecture of antiquity influences the architecture of today. There's a brutalism there that I find, in one way assaulting, but in another way very, very interesting, very human in its lack of refinement. And I'm patching these together, I'm overpainting, and I'm finding the color on the painting. So these paintings register different kinds of light, and you see that in the corner, bottom left, are two gray bars, and that's what's left from the original version of this picture. Now, lately I returned to this kind of structure, and I was thinking about Arles and France and Van Gogh, and this use of yellow in the work of Van Gogh, this sick yellow. And I started to have the idea to paint a same painting 3 times. So each time it was a portrait of itself. It has no real beginning and no real end because it's the beginning of infinity, a number 3, which a form I use a lot. And I'm in a way representing different times of the day, or different moods, different times of the day, and each one is supposed to register another emotion. And it also testifies to the infinite endless possibility of painting and how inexhaustible painting is, that it can be painted again and again and again and again, and it never seems to run out of possibilities, even if you don't change the drawing, which I didn't. So there's a sense of serialization within this one work, and there's a sense that's almost technological, even though it's hand-drawn, because the differences are the differences of the hand, but the idea, the concept is that it's the same. So there's this argument going on between what is hand-drawn and what is a willful idea to continue. Now I've made several of these, and I would like to make at least one more. And this one is probably called Al Abend Vincent or Al Nacht Vincent, but they all are little homages to Al and to Van Gogh. And I've been to Arles many times, and I find that whole area of France to be so hypnotic, and that's really my basis. It's what I first fell in love with when I first was looking at painting, and I saw the Impressionists. I wanted to be an Impressionist, but of course the train had already left the station. I couldn't be an Impressionist, but it still affects me greatly. There's a wall of landline paintings upstairs. We left the city a while ago when our son was 3. We didn't want him to grow up in Manhattan, and he didn't want to either. So we moved to the other side of the river, and now we live near the River Hudson, which is an incredible river. It's 4.5 kilometers wide. It is absolutely mighty, and it is an estuary, so it's filled up from the ocean. And to live there is something quite special. It is, as we found to our great sorrow, populated by supporters of Trump, which has caused us a certain amount of distress. We didn't realize that all these smiling people were the people that put this maniac in the White House. So we have removed ourselves for a while, and we are having a holiday from America. I started to think a lot about nature because we have an existential threat on our hands. We have this beautiful garden that we have been given to live in, and we've done everything possible to wreck it. So we are thinking a lot about the environment. Our son is thinking about the environment. He's very responsible, as the younger generation are. They don't just throw rubbish around. And we are thinking about ways to save the situation. And I personally am planting a lot of trees, which is a fight against, of course, the production of carbon. And it's crept into my work, no doubt. And it's not really necessary for us anymore to prove how abstract we can be in art. That's already done. All that kind of stuff is done. And it's over. And we are also living, I think, in a period where we've become ahistorical. So the linear story of the history of art has broken down because now we have different problems, the environment and integration and everybody wants to be included. So the story of art has changed. Instead of it being linear, it's become horizontal. And it's very difficult to know where its direction is. But what I do know about my work is that it has been influenced by this concern for nature. And in a way, these paintings of mine can be seen certainly as landscapes, hence the title. They have their origin in a photograph of a cliff and a beach and a sea and the sky, called Land, Sea, Sky. So they become clearly figurative. They're not called maroon over orange. They are making a direct, clear allusion to the real world, to the natural world. And of course, I carry forward the idea of seriality, repetition, and rhythm, which I get from music, and of course my days as a minimalist, but they are informed by all natural elements, all the colors in the world, and I'm very responsive to this. I make the color on the painting, and I don't draw these paintings. I just start painting them. And when I paint them, I don't know how they're going to end up drawn. I don't know how many stripes are going to be on the painting. But I always start in the middle of the picture because that's the easiest. And then I start to work the painting, and then I find the colors as I work. And this is something that goes very quickly on metal. The brush skids across the surface, and it's mixing in with other colors. I'm making these interesting edges, and I'm making colors that are highly nuanced and I can't describe. And I have no clue how the painting is going to turn out when I start. It's a true adventure. I know when it's finished. How I know, I can't say, but I know. They're very intuitive paintings. And of course, the vertical architecture has disappeared from them. So once you do that, once you take the verticality out, which is absolutely man-made, you're dealing with the sweep of nature. And they become very associational. So, going back to something our wonderful curator said, here's a painting that looks like it could be on the screen of a computer. And what we do now, it occurred to me, is we cannibalize, we repeat. If we look in our pockets at our iPhones, we'll see that many of us have the same model. So we don't make things anymore that are, in a sense, crafted, except, of course, in painting, which is insistently so. Insisting on the hand. So what I've done here is tried to turn painting inside out by pulling out rectangles from the body of the painting, changing them around, putting them in the wrong place, and the wrong place, of course, being the right place, and the right place could be, of course, the wrong place, and making things displaced. This brings up lots of issues, such as immigration, displacement, and computer logic. But of course, at the same time, I'm holding on to a very romantic idea of painting as an emotional action, as a very physical commitment. And it includes street art because of the spray gun. And as you can see, I've taken an insert from the bottom left of the painting and put it in the top part of the painting. So everything is moving around, and in a sense it's a reflection of what's going on in the world. Things are in the wrong place, or people are in the wrong place. People are moving around, everything is destabilized, and everything is patched together. And that's why I've given it the title, What Makes Us? Because this kind of patchworking and this sense of migration is what makes us now. This repetition, this reusing, this cannibalization of material and putting it into different places is what makes us. This is a sculpture that's up in the gallery. I'm happy to say, I'm very pleased to be able to show it. They're frames, and they contain, as does the floating painting that I showed you earlier, a space. There's a space inside, because these are not solid, but there's a space you can feel but you can't see. So they hold some kind of air inside. I got this idea from a poem by Seamus Heaney, who's a very, very dear friend of mine. And it's in a series of poems called Bogland. He said, I saw an astounding crate full of air. I thought it was an incredible line. Because most people would say, I saw an empty crate, or box, crate. But for him it was astounding. And it moved me very greatly, as did earlier on in my life the poetry of Miroslav Holub, who's a scientist who dealt with the transcendental beauty in the ordinary. And I deal with the ordinary. These are ordinary in some way. There's nothing about them that's so special. And there's nothing about the shapes that I use in my paintings that's so special either. They're full of commonality. You can see these things around anywhere. You can see frames around. You can see stripes, checkerboards. The floor is made of checkerboard in this room. And what I try to do is to take the ordinary and make it in some way exalted. Here's a figurative painting, which was an excursion into figuration, or return to figuration, for a very special reason. I wanted to represent in painting my son and the author of my son, his mother. So I made paintings that were called Madonna, and there are pictures of them on the beach, painted with a great deal of expression, of course. I was taking photographs, and photographs make, in a sense, realism redundant, because now we have cameras. But I was thinking that the photographs that I was taking of them on the beach in a place where we go every year, on an island, weren't somehow enough, and I wanted to make something that was permanent. And I started painting these paintings. I made about 30 or 35, and it doesn't prefigure a return to figuration. I'm committed to making abstraction, and that's what I do, and I'm committed to that international language, which started, of course, at the time of the Russian Revolution. But I do love to make these paintings, and they are very inspired in some way. So this one, I must have conjured up by mentioning the Russian Revolution. Obviously, it relates to Malevich. We are in a time of COVID, and we are in the time of a rise of the right in politics. So we are in a dark time. And what I wanted to show in this painting was a nihilism of the black square, which represents the impossibility of seeing forward in where we live, which is, of course, represented by a landline. So we live in a landline, or we live in a landscape, and this is what's possible. So I paint what's possible, and in the center of it, I paint what's not possible. And this is inserted into it. It's not on the same surface. That's very important. It's an insert, an imposition, an intrusion, an obstacle to a view. So my window, which is in other paintings, another view, another structure, has gone black, has gone dark. The lights have gone out. The lights have gone out on our view, and I think these paintings are very apropos to the time we live in, and may become very powerful in the future as a symbol of it. So this is a time for great reflection. So I make what I suppose is a stern rebuke to our excesses in the middle of a very romantic painting. And I think we might have arrived at our station. We have indeed.